The last Gorith transport lifted off Osir 4 3 days ago, and nobody blamed them for leaving. Half the coalition positions on the eastern continent were already overrun. Dominion artillery had turned the forward trenches into graveyards, and the sky above the valley flickered orange every night from bombardments that never seemed to stop. Drell crouched behind a collapsed wall and watched the dust settle from another explosion somewhere to the north. His 4 arms ached from carrying equipment across broken ground, and his scales were caked in dried mud that no amount of scraping could remove. He was a combat officer in the Felvari 3rd Division. His species was known across coalition space for tactical discipline, cold logic under fire, and a near total absence of emotional interference during operations. These qualities had kept Drell alive through 11 campaigns. But Osir 4 was different. Osir 4 was where logic came to die. The Coalition was supposed to hold this planet. If it fell, the Mirren Corridor would collapse, and 3 homeworlds would be exposed to direct Dominion assault. Everyone understood the stakes. Understanding had not stopped 2 allied species from pulling out entirely. The Gorith claimed strategic redeployment. The Celanese cited unsustainable losses. What remained was Drell's battered Felvari platoon, a handful of support units from minor coalition species, and a growing certainty that Command had written this planet off. Then the reinforcements arrived. Drell had requested Gorith shock troops. Failing that, another Felvari battalion. What Command sent instead was a single company of humans. He watched them come down the ramp of their dropship and felt something close to irritation. Humans were relatively new to coalition warfare. They were smaller than Gorith, less disciplined than Felvari, and had a reputation across the Alliance for being emotionally unstable in combat. Drell had read reports from joint operations on other worlds. The consensus among non-human officers was consistent. Humans were unpredictable, reckless, and difficult to command within structured doctrine. Their captain came down last. A woman named Lena Novak. She was lean, not tall by human standards, and moved with a calm that did not match the burning horizon behind her. She scanned the camp, the broken fortifications, the shell craters, and said nothing. Beside her walked a large man with deep brown skin and steady eyes. Sergeant Idris Okafor. He did not wait for introductions. He walked straight past the command post and began circling the perimeter alone, studying the terrain, crouching at firing positions, running his hands along damaged walls as if reading them. Drell reported to Novak and briefed her on the situation. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 3 questions. Where was the Dominion's nearest artillery position? What was the water table depth beneath the eastern ridge? And how long had it been since anyone had slept more than 3 hours? Drell answered the first 2. The third made him pause. No one had asked that before that evening came. Drell observed the humans setting up their camp. What he saw disturbed him. They were loud. They talked constantly, not about tactics or positions, but about meaningless things. Somebody's sister back home. A game involving a ball that Drell could not understand the rules of. A song that 3 of them seemed to know the words to and sang badly. While unpacking ammunition crates, .1 soldier had attached a small photograph to the inside of her helmet. Another was drawing something in a notebook. A third was doing physical exercises that served no apparent tactical purpose, lifting a heavy container above his head repeatedly while others counted. The Dominion front line was less than 6 kilometers away. Drell could hear their vehicles moving in the darkness. And these humans were laughing that he found Novak at the command post reviewing terrain maps. He asked her carefully whether her soldiers understood the proximity of the enemy. Novak looked at him for a moment. "They know exactly where the enemy is," she said. "That is why they are laughing." Drell did not understand. He filed it as another example of human irrationality and returned to his platoon. The bombardment came at dusk without warning. Dominion shells screamed across the valley and hit the northern section of the camp. The ground split open. Fire erupted. Debris flew in every direction, and the air turned into a wall of noise and heat that made Drell's scales vibrate painfully. His Felvari soldiers responded as trained. They moved to cover positions in tight formation, weapons ready, scanning for ground assault. Efficient, controlled, exactly as doctrine required. Drell turned to see how the humans were handling it, expecting chaos, expecting panic and disorder, and proof of everything he had read in those reports. What he saw instead made something cold move through his chest. The humans were already moving. Not running, not scrambling. Moving. Every soldier was in motion with a purpose Drell could see but not explain. Squads formed without verbal orders. Weapons came up in unison. Okafor appeared from somewhere covered in dust and pointed twice. And two fire teams split off toward the northern breach as if they had rehearsed this exact moment 1,000 times. Nobody screamed. Nobody froze. The same soldiers who had been singing 5 minutes ago were now flowing through the smoke like water through cracks in stone. Novak stood in the open, completely exposed, directing movement with hand signals while shells still fell around her. A blast threw dirt across her face, and she did not flinch. Drell watched all of this. His 4 hands tightened around his weapon, that he had seen disciplined soldiers before. His own species was built on discipline. But this was something else. This was not the absence of fear. He could see in their eyes, in the way their hands trembled slightly between movements, in the tightness of their jaws. They were afraid. Every single one of them was afraid, and not one of them slowed down. 12 hours after the bombardment, the Dominions sent their ground assault. Drell had expected it. Every tactical model predicted a probing attack following sustained artillery. The Dominion was predictable in that way. Soften the position, test the defenders, measure the response, then commit the main force once weaknesses were mapped. It was clean, logical warfare. Drell respected it even as he prepared to fight against it. The first wave came through the valley floor at dawn. Rethkin infantry in dark armor, hundreds of them advancing in tight columns with armored walkers stomping between the formations. The walkers were 6-legged machines, each carrying twin plasma cannons that could melt through reinforced walls at range. The ground shook beneath their steps, and Drell felt the vibration travel up through his legs and settle in his chest like a second heartbeat. His Felvari platoon opened fire at optimal range. Precise, controlled bursts. Every shot placed with the kind of mathematical accuracy that Felvari marksmanship was famous for. They dropped dozens of Rethkin soldiers in the first exchange. The overlapping fields of fire worked exactly as designed. Kill zone after kill zone activated in sequence, and the Dominion advance slowed. But it did not stop. The Rethkin kept coming. They stepped over their dead and kept marching. The walkers adjusted their cannons and began hammering the Felvari positions with concentrated fire. Walls crumbled. One of Drell's soldiers took a plasma around to the shoulder and collapsed without a sound. Another was buried under falling debris. The sheer volume of the Dominion force was doing what it always did, absorbing losses and grinding forward through pure weight of numbers. Drell calculated the rate of advance against his remaining ammunition and the structural integrity of his cover positions. The math was not good. At this rate, the Dominion would overrun the forward line within 30 minutes. Then Sergeant Okafor did something that broke every tactical rule Drell had ever learned. He took a squad of 8 soldiers and ran directly into the gap between 2 Dominion columns. Not around them, not behind them, into the space between them, where the crossfire from both columns made survival statistically impossible. Drell saw it happen, and his mind simply refused to process it. No trained soldier moved into a convergence zone voluntarily. It was the single most dangerous piece of ground on any battlefield. Going there was not brave. It was mathematically insane that Okafor's squad hit the right column from inside the formation. They were so close that the Rethkin soldiers could not use their heavy weapons without hitting their own forces. The squad fought at arm's length, using short-range weapons and explosives that turned the orderly Dominion column into a screaming mess of confusion and friendly fire. The Rethkin were trained to fight enemies in front of them. Their doctrine was built around forward-facing engagement. They had no protocol for threats erupting inside their own ranks because no species in the coalition had ever been insane enough to put soldiers there. The right column collapsed inward. Soldiers turned to face the wrong direction. Units lost formation. Officers shouted contradicting orders. And in that moment of chaos, Captain Novak struck from the front. She had positioned to rest a Bravo company in a crescent formation that nobody had noticed during the initial exchange. While every eye was on the Felvari defensive line, Novak soldiers had moved into positions that only made sense if someone created confusion in the Dominion ranks first. She had planned this. Before the battle even started, she had planned for Okafor to do the impossible thing, and she had built her entire strategy around the chaos it would create. The crescent closed like a jaw. Human soldiers poured fire into the disorganized Dominion forces from 3 angles simultaneously. The armored walkers, designed to advance against fixed positions, found themselves surrounded by fast-moving infantry that appeared from directions their targeting systems were not calibrated for. Within 40 minutes, the probing assault collapsed completely. Rethkin soldiers broke ranks and retreated across the valley floor, leaving their dead and 2 disabled walkers behind. The battlefield fell quiet except for the crackling of fires and the distant sound of Dominion vehicles pulling back. Drell stood in his position and stared at the carnage. His 4 hands hung at his sides. His weapon was still warm that he had fought in 11 campaigns. He had never seen a battle turn that fast that Okafor's squad came back through the smoke. 3 of the 8 were wounded. 1 was being carried. They were covered in blood. Some of it theirs, some of it not. They were shaking. Their eyes were wide and glassy with the aftermath of what they had just done. And they were alive. All 8 of them were alive, which should not have been possible. Drell walked toward the human camp that evening. He found a young soldier sitting on an ammunition crate, cleaning her weapon with hands that still trembled slightly. He asked her a question that had been building inside him since the battle ended. How did your sergeant lead his squad into that gap? How did they follow him into a place where they should have died? The soldier looked up at him. She thought about it for a moment, as if the answer was so obvious that she had never needed to put it into words before. "We trust Okafor," she said. And Okafor trusted the gap. Drell stood there in the fading light and realized that his definition of courage might be incomplete. The Felvari understood courage as the suppression of fear through logic, the absence of emotional interference, a calm mind calculating the correct action. The humans had not suppressed anything. They had been terrified. He had seen it in their faces, in their shaking hands, in the ragged breathing that followed them back from the killing ground. They had been terrified, and they had charged into the most dangerous space on the battlefield anyway, because one man told them he believed they could make it through. That was not the absence of fear. That was something else entirely. 2 days passed without a major assault, and Drell used every hour of it to study the humans. Not their weapons or their equipment, which were unremarkable by coalition standards, but the way they thought, the way they planned, the way their minds seemed to operate on a frequency that his species had no name for. Coalition Command ordered a joint defense plan for the Eastern Ridge. The ridge was the highest ground in the sector, and whoever held it controlled the approach to the valley below. Drell was assigned to coordinate directly with Captain Novak, and he entered the planning session with 14 pages of tactical calculations prepared in advance. He presented the Felvari approach first. Overlapping fields of fire arranged in geometric precision. Kill zones mapped to the meter. Fallback positions designated in sequence with exact timing for each withdrawal phase. Communication checkpoints every 90 seconds. Every variable accounted for. Every response predetermined. It was clean, efficient, and it had kept Felvari's soldiers alive for centuries. Novak studied his plans carefully. She nodded at the firing positions. She agreed with the kill zone placement. She accepted the fallback sequence with only minor adjustments. Then she added something that made Drell's scales tighten with discomfort. She gave every squad on the ridge independent authority to make their own decisions if communication failed. Drell objected immediately. Independent authority without central coordination would create chaos. Squads moving on their own initiative could interfere with each other, create gaps in the line, or expose flanks that the overall plan was designed to protect. Decentralized command was the opposite of everything the Felvari military was built on. Novak listened to his objections without interrupting. When he finished, she said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. Chaos is coming whether we invite it or not. The only question is who rides it better. Drell did not agree. He filed her approach as another example of human overconfidence and returned to his platoon to prepare the ridge defense according to proper doctrine. The Dominion hit the eastern ridge at nightfall with a force 3 times larger than any projection had estimated. They came from 2 directions simultaneously, which was unusual for Rethkin doctrine. Heavy infantry from the north and mechanized units from the east, converging on the ridge in a coordinated assault that suggested the Dominion had spent the 2 quiet days planning something far more sophisticated than a standard advance. Within the first 5 minutes, they jammed all coalition communications. Drell's command channel turned to static. His backup frequency was dead. His emergency signal produced nothing but a high-pitched whine that hurt his hearing. He was cut off from every other unit on the ridge, from Coalition Command, from Captain Novak, from everyone. His platoon looked at him. Trained Felvari soldiers, disciplined and precise, waiting for orders from their officer who was waiting for orders from command that would never come. They froze, not from cowardice, from doctrine. Felvari soldiers without orders held position and waited. That was the rule. That was what kept units from making independent mistakes that could collapse an entire defensive line. Hold and wait. Hold and wait. The Dominion was not waiting. Rethkin soldiers poured up the northern slope in waves. Plasma fire lit up the darkness. Explosions tore through the defensive positions to Drell's left, and he heard screaming from species he could not identify. And then he heard the humans. Not on the radio. Not through any communication channel. He heard them with his own ears. Gunfire. Controlled bursts. Moving. Every human squad on the ridge was fighting independently. Without orders from Novak, without coordination from any central command, each squad had assessed its own situation and started making decisions. One squad shifted west to cover a gap that the Dominion assault had created. Another pulled back 30 meters to higher ground and established a new firing position that raked the Rethkin advance from an angle nobody had planned for. A third squad moved forward directly into the assault to buy time for the others to reposition. None of them had been told to do any of this. They just did it. Each squad saw what needed to happen and acted on that understanding without waiting for permission. Drell watched this through the flashes of plasma fire and the orange glow of burning fortifications. His platoon was still holding position, still waiting for orders that existed nowhere except in dead radio channels that a human squad to his right was about to be flanked. He could see the Rethkin unit moving through a shallow trench that would put them behind the humans within minutes. The humans did not see it. They were focused forward, pouring fire into the main assault. Drell made a decision that violated every principle his military career was built on. He moved his platoon without orders. They swept into the shallow trench and caught the flanking Rethkin unit from the side. Felvari marksmanship at close range was devastating. The flanking force died in the trench without ever reaching the human squad. The human squad leader turned and saw Drell's platoon in the trench. He raised a fist in the air. Drell did not know what that gesture meant, but the expression on the human's face was unmistakable. The ridge held. It held because every unit on it, human and Felvari alike, fought not according to a plan that had already been destroyed, but according to what was happening right in front of them. After the battle, Novak found Drell sitting against a broken wall. She sat beside him and said nothing for a while. Then she spoke. "Fear is not the enemy," she said. "Hesitation is." Drell looked at his forehands. They were still shaking. She was right. The sound of powered exoskeletons was different from anything else on the battlefield. Regular Rethkin infantry marched with a rhythm that Drell had learned to read like a clock, counting the seconds between footfalls to estimate distance and speed. But the vanguard units moved with a deep mechanical thrum that vibrated through the ground itself, a low pulse that Drell felt in his bones before he heard it with his ears. The Dominion had deployed 12 vanguard soldiers to Osir 4. Each one stood 3 meters tall in their powered armor. Each one carried weapons that could punch through fortified walls. Each one had been responsible for breaking coalition defensive lines on at least 4 other worlds. Coalition command responded with the only logical order: tactical withdrawal from all forward positions, fall back to the secondary line, consolidate defenses, and wait for fleet support that was still days away. Every species agreed. The Gorith would have agreed if they were still here. The math was simple. Standard infantry could not hold against vanguard units in fixed positions. Retreat was the survivable choice. The humans refused. Captain Novak stood in the command bunker and argued her case with a calm that made Drell's scales itch. If the Coalition gave up the forward ridge, the Dominion would use it to stage heavy plasma batteries within range of the entire valley. Once those batteries were operational, the secondary line would become indefensible. Retreating now would save lives today and lose the planet tomorrow. She was right. Every officer in the room knew she was right. The problem was that holding the ridge against Vanguard units was not a tactical option. It was a death sentence. Novak did not argue further. She simply told Command that Bravo Company would hold the ridge regardless of what the Coalition decided to do. Then she walked out. Drell followed her. He asked her if she understood what Vanguard units would do to infantry in open fortifications. She looked at him and said, yes, she understood exactly what they would do. He watched the humans prepare that evening. It was the quietest he had ever seen them. The jokes and laughter that had disturbed him when they first arrived were gone. In their place was something that Drell had no Felvari word for. A focused silence that was heavier than noise. They checked their weapons. They reinforced positions. They distributed the last of their heavy munitions, dividing everything with a fairness that left no squad better equipped than another. And they did things that had nothing to do with warfare, that a soldier sat against a wall and wrote on a folded piece of paper. When she finished, she sealed it and wrote a name on the outside and tucked it inside her vest. Another soldier showed photographs to the man beside him, pointing at faces and saying names that Drell could not hear. A third stood alone at the edge of the ridge, looking at the sky, lips moving without sound. One soldier hummed a song while loading magazines. The melody was slow and simple. Others nearby did not tell him to stop. They knew what was coming. They all knew, and they were still here. The Vanguard assault hit at midnight. The first exoskeleton came through the northern approach and took a direct hit from a human anti-armor weapon. The explosion lit up the night. The exoskeleton staggered, but did not fall. Its armor held. It raised one massive arm and returned fire, and the position that had fired the shot ceased to exist. Then the rest of them came. Drell watched from his position behind the ridge as Vanguard units smashed through the forward fortifications like they were made of paper. Human soldiers fired everything they had. Rockets, grenades, concentrated small arms fire aimed at joint sections and sensor arrays. Some of it worked. Most of it did not. A Vanguard soldier stepped into a trench and swung its arm. 3 human soldiers flew through the air like broken toys. A fire team on the left flank was pinned behind a wall that was being systematically destroyed by plasma fire, each blast taking away another layer of protection. And then Drell saw something that stopped his breath. A human medic, a woman with blood running down her own shattered arm, dragged a wounded soldier across open ground toward cover. Plasma bolts struck the dirt around her. Debris pelted her back. She did not stop. She pulled that soldier 20 meters with one working arm and collapsed behind a wall that was barely standing. A fire team ran out of ammunition. Instead of retreating, they built improvised explosives from power cells and equipment scraps and detonated them manually as a Vanguard unit stepped over their position. The explosion damaged the exoskeleton's leg actuator, and the massive machine stumbled, slowed, and became a target that other squads could finally hit. Drell looked at his platoon. They looked back at him. He gave the order. They moved back to the ridge. His commander's voice crackled through the restored communication channel, demanding to know what he was doing. Drell turned the channel off. His platoon hit the eastern slope and joined the human defensive line. Felvari marksmen targeted the sensor arrays and joint mechanisms that human weapons struggled to penetrate. For arms meant Drell could stabilize a heavy weapon while simultaneously feeding ammunition from a second position. His soldiers found the weak points in the Vanguard armor and exploited them with surgical precision, while human fire teams provided covering volleys that kept the exoskeletons from focusing on any single position. Other coalition units saw the Felvari moving back toward the ridge. One by one, they followed. The ridge held. Barely. The cost was terrible. Sergeant Okafor was pulled from a collapsed trench with wounds that should have killed him. Captain Novak carried him over her shoulders across 200 meters of open ground while her soldiers covered her with everything they had left. Drell sat in the ruins afterward. Around him, human and Felvari soldiers leaned against broken walls, breathing, bleeding alive, that he understood now. Humans did not lack fear. They feared everything. They feared the dark, the pain, the death waiting in every shadow on that ridge. They fought anyway. That was the difference. Rain began falling on the third morning after the Vanguard assault, and it did not stop. Thick, gray sheets of water poured from a sky that looked like it was made of iron, turning the trenches into rivers and the open ground into a swamp that sucked at boots and claws alike. Drell scales, designed for dry heat, ached constantly in the cold damp. His platoon huddled in whatever shelter they could find and waited for the Dominion's next move. But the Dominion was waiting too. The losses on the ridge had surprised them. Their Vanguard units were supposed to break the coalition line in a single assault, and instead they had lost 3 exoskeletons and dozens of infantry against defenders who should have been destroyed. Intelligence reports suggested the Dominion was pulling reinforcements from 2 other sectors to prepare a final, overwhelming assault. When it came, there would be no surviving it. Captain Novak called a joint briefing in the remains of the command bunker. Water dripped from the cracked ceiling and pooled in the corners. Coalition officers from 4 species sat on broken furniture and listened as Novak stood in front of a terrain map that was already soaked at the edges. She proposed a counteroffensive. The room went silent. Novak pointed to a position 4 kilometers behind Dominion lines, a staging area where the enemy was assembling their reinforcements, stockpiling ammunition, and repairing damaged equipment. If they destroyed it before the final assault, the Dominion would lose the logistical backbone needed for a sustained offensive. Without supplies, their attack would collapse before it began. The Felvari colonel was the first to speak. He called the plans suicidal. A strike force moving 4 kilometers behind enemy lines through occupied territory, past Dominion patrols, sensor arrays, and reserve units. No coalition force had ever successfully operated behind Dominion lines on Osir 4. The probability of the strike team returning alive was below acceptable thresholds that a Selani liaison officer agreed. The risk-to-reward ratio was beyond any reasonable calculation. Novak did not argue with their math. Instead, she pulled out a set of notes that no one had expected. For 3 days, while the coalition had been recovering from the Vanguard assault, human scouts had been operating beyond the front lines. Nobody had noticed them deploying. Nobody had authorized it. Small teams of 2 and 3 had crawled through the mud and the rain into Dominion-held territory and come back with information that changed the equation entirely. They had mapped every patrol route. They had timed every guard rotation. They had identified a weather pattern that would reduce Dominion sensor effectiveness by 60% during a specific 4-hour window. They had counted vehicles, observed supply schedules, and found a narrow ravine that ran within 500 meters of the staging area, completely unmonitored because the Dominion considered it impassable in the rain. Novak laid all of this out piece by piece. Her plan accounted for variables that no Felvari tactical model would have included: weather, psychology, the specific behavioral patterns of Rethkin rear-line troops who had been sitting in a staging area for days and had grown comfortable in the belief that the fight was happening somewhere else, that IT was reckless by every standard Drell had been trained on. It also accounted for things that Doctrine never considered. Drell volunteered his platoon before he fully understood why. His own Felvari commander contacted him privately afterward. He called Drell foolish. He said this operation would end in dead Felvari soldiers for a human fantasy. Drell replied that the humans had been foolish since they arrived on this planet, and they were the only reason the ridge still existed. Then he switched off the channel. The strike force moved out at midnight during the heaviest rainfall. Novak led from the front. Okafor, bandaged and limping from wounds that had not fully healed, refused to stay behind. Drell's platoon moved in the center of the column, their four-armed frames carrying double the equipment load of any human soldier. They entered the ravine in total darkness. The water was knee-deep and moving fast. Rocks shifted underfoot. One wrong step meant a broken ankle, and a broken ankle this deep behind enemy lines meant death. Drell used his lower pair of arms to brace against the ravine walls while his upper pair kept his weapon dry and ready. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were rain, rushing water, and breathing. They cleared the ravine after 2 hours and reached the edge of the staging area exactly when the sensor-degrading weather window opened. Novak gave the signal. The attack was fast and violent. Human soldiers hit the supply dumps with incendiary charges, while Drell's Felvari marksmen picked off guards and communication officers before they could send alerts. The staging area erupted in fire. Ammunition stores detonated in chain reactions that sent pillars of flame into the rain-soaked sky. Baiklas exploda. Fuel reserves turned into rivers of burning liquid that spread across the compound. The Dominion response came faster than expected. Reserve units scrambled from positions that the scouts had not detected. A firefight erupted on the southern perimeter of the staging area, and Drell found himself fighting beside humans in close quarters for the first time that he saw them at their most raw. A human soldier screaming as she fired into a doorway where Rethkin soldiers were massing. A man with blood on his face pulling a wounded comrade behind a burning vehicle while returning fire with his free hand. Okafor, barely able to stand, directing movements with a voice that carried over the explosions like a blade through cloth. They were terrified. Every one of them. Drell could smell it, a chemical signature that his species could detect as clearly as light. Human fear had a sharp, acidic quality that filled the air around them like smoke, and they would not stop moving forward. The strike force fought their way out as the staging area burned behind them. The retreat was brutal. Dominion pursuit teams followed them into the ravine. 2 human soldiers and 1 Felvari were killed in the darkness. Others were wounded. Drell took a plasma graze across his upper left arm that burned through 3 layers of scales. They made it back to coalition lines as dawn broke. Behind them, the Dominion staging area was still burning, a column of black smoke rising into the gray sky like a signal visible for 50 kilometers. Drell collapsed against a wall and looked at the humans around him. Broken, bleeding, shaking, alive, they had done the impossible thing. Again, the fires from his staging area burned for 2 full days. Drell could see the glow on the horizon every night, a fading orange stain against the darkness that reminded the entire valley of what a small group of soldiers had done behind enemy lines. The Dominion attempted 2 minor probing attacks during that time, but both were half-hearted, disorganized, and collapsed before they reached the forward positions. Without their staging area, the enemy had no supply chain, no ammunition reserves, and no way to sustain a major offensive that on the third day, coalition fleet support arrived. 7 warships dropped out of faster-than-light transit and took positions in orbit above Osir 4. Within hours, they began precision strikes on Dominion positions across the eastern continent. Ground-based sensor stations were destroyed. Artillery emplacements that had terrorized the valley for weeks were silenced one by one. Transport routes were cut. The Dominion began full withdrawal by the end of the day. Drell sat on a broken piece of wall near the eastern ridge and watched the smoke rise from distant Dominion positions as the fleet worked. His 4 arms hung at his sides. His armor was cracked in 3 places. The plasma burn on his upper left arm had been treated by a human medic who had wrapped it with a material that smelled faintly of chemicals Drell could not identify. It itched, but it was healing. Around him, the survivors of the battle mixed together in a way that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. Human soldiers sat beside Felvari. A Selani communication officer shared water with a human sergeant. Nobody separated by species. Nobody seemed to notice the difference anymore. Sergeant Okafor limped over and lowered himself onto the wall beside Drell. He moved slowly, favoring his left side where the wounds from the ridge battle had not fully closed. His face was tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. But his eyes were steady. They were always steady. They sat in silence for a while. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have bled together and do not need words to acknowledge it. Okafor spoke first. He thanked Drell for bringing his platoon back to the ridge during the Vanguard assault. He said that decision had changed the battle, maybe changed the war on this planet. Drell looked at his hands. He flexed his 4 fingers on each and watched the damage scale shift. He told Okafor that he did not come back for the ridge. Okafor looked at him. He did not ask what Drell had come back for. He did not need to. He just nodded once, slowly, and that was enough. Captain Novak submitted her after-action report to Coalition Command that evening. Drell knew this because she showed him a section of it before sending. She had listed his Felvari platoon as integral to the defense of the Eastern Ridge and to the counteroffensive against the staging area. She recommended that Coalition Command study the joint human-Felvari combat model for future multi-species deployments. She had written his name specifically, along with a commendation that Drell suspected would cause significant discomfort among his own military hierarchy. He did not ask her to remove it. That night, Drell sat alone in a quiet corner of the camp and wrote his own report. It was required. Every Felvari officer filed a detailed tactical analysis after every campaign. The reports were dry documents, filled with numbers and assessments and clinical observations stripped of any emotional content. That was the Felvari way. Drell's report was different. He included the numbers. He included the tactical assessments. He documented every engagement with the precision expected of his rank. But at the end, he added a passage that broke every convention of Felvari military writing that he wrote about fear, Before Osir 4, he wrote, "I believe fear was the failure of logic, the moment when a soldier's mind broke under pressure and emotional noise overwhelmed rational calculation. I believe that the best soldiers were those who felt the least. My species built an entire military doctrine around this belief, and for centuries it served us well. The humans taught me that I was wrong. Fear is not a failure. It is a signal. It tells a soldier that death is close, that the situation is beyond safe margins, that the body wants to run. What matters is not whether you feel it. What matters is what you do while it's screaming inside you. The humans feel fear more than any species I have ever served beside. I could smell it on them. I could see it in the way their hands shook and their breathing changed and their pupils widened until their eyes were almost black. They feel it in their muscles, in their stomachs, in the trembling of their voices between orders. And they fight harder than any species I have known. That I do not think that is a coincidence, that I believe the humans are not brave despite their fear. I believe they are brave because of it. The fear tells them what is at stake. It reminds them what they stand to lose. And instead of shutting it down the way my species does, they let it burn inside them like fuel, and they use it to push forward into places where no rational mind would go. That I was wrong about them. I suspect the entire coalition has been wrong about them. He filed a report. Months later, he would learn that the passage had been extracted and distributed across Felvari military academies as required reading. But that was later. In the moment, he simply saved the file and closed his eyes. The transport arrived the next morning. Coalition forces were rotating off Osir 4 now that the fleet had secured orbital control. Drell's platoon, or what remained of it, was among the first scheduled for extraction. He walked to the landing zone with his kit over two of his shoulders and his weapon slung across the other two. The morning air was cool, and the rain had finally stopped. Somewhere behind him, a human soldier was playing music from a small device, and other humans were talking and laughing the way they always did, as if the world had not almost ended a week ago. A young Felvari officer from the incoming rotation was standing near the transport ramp, watching the human camp with the same expression Drell had worn when Bravo Company first arrived. Suspicion, confusion, that quiet Felvari certainty that emotional species could not be trusted in warfare. The young officer saw Drell's rank insignia and straightened. He asked Drell what the humans were like to fight beside. He asked it the way someone asks about a curiosity, a strange thing they have heard about but never experienced. Drell stopped walking. He looked back at the camp. He could see Novak near the command post, reviewing something on a datapad. Okafor was sitting in his usual spot, watching everything with those steady eyes. The soldier with the music turned the volume up, and someone laughed. Drell looked at the young officer. "They will make you afraid," he said. "And then they will show you what afraid really means." That he turned and walked up the ramp. The transport doors closed behind him, and Osir 4 fell away beneath the rising ship, growing smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light in a galaxy full of wars. But Drell was not the same soldier who had landed on that planet. The Felvari officer who had believed that fear was a weakness was gone. In his place was someone who had learned, in blood and fire and the company of humans, that the most terrifying soldiers in the galaxy were not the ones who felt nothing. They were the ones who felt everything and fought anyway.